Welcome, everybody. I am so thrilled that you are here. I know it is an incredible, gorgeous day, and we're counting how many more we have left in this summer season, so we appreciate you coming. My name is Sue Muncaster. I'm the current executive director of the Teton Leadership Center, which is a collaboration between Central Wyoming College and Silicon Core. We exist to promote purpose-driven, values-based leadership, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. This event is part of Central Wyoming College's Teton Talks. They've been doing a talk on all kinds of different subjects throughout the year. I did want to make a couple of announcements. Thursday morning is an exciting day for Central Wyoming College. It's going to be the groundbreaking on their new campus out at the high school at 10 o'clock. It's a really exciting time for our community. And then there's information on the back table. We are exactly 1 month away from our fall summit, which will be out at the Walk Festival Hall. It's a Thursday evening and Friday. We're calling it Human Intelligence, Bold Leadership for a Purpose-Driven Future. And we're going to build on what we did last year, which was a lot about finding your purpose and leading from the heart and those kinds of things. And now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of when you have a great idea, how do you think differently and have the skills to bring ideas for the future to fruition. And just wanted to thank, there's a number of people here from Central Wyoming College, if you don't mind raising your hand, including the president in the back, Fred Keller, so they're all here for the week. Have come in from Riverton, so when we're done here, hopefully you can introduce yourselves to them and let them know who you are and why you're here. And why are we here? I think that everybody in this room is well aware of the stresses facing the U.S. and the rest of the world. And increasingly, we've realized that depending on nonprofits and government entities is not going to solve our problems. And we've come together with Fred Keller and Kellogg. I'm going to introduce themselves in a second. But the three of us all believe that capitalism is not a bad word and that the businesses and entrepreneurs of today have just an unprecedented opportunity to change the way that we do business for social and environmental good as well as profitability. So I met Fred last year. He spoke at the conference, and I was introduced to some of his ideas that were so exciting about reframing capitalism, and I just wanted to share a quote that has stuck with me. It's to ignore the capability business has to solve difficult, complex problems is to waste the single greatest opportunity the world has to solve its toughest problems. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Fred and Rob are going to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what their sort of specialties are. And then this is a dialogue, this is a community conversation, so we'll open it up to you to ask questions. And I have some board questions, so we'll see how it goes. This is an open conversation and directed to where you all want to go.
Are you looking at me?
Yep.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, how's the volume? Okay. Thank you for coming. And this is truly a conversation. We hope to be able to get at a little bit about what your interests are. This is for you, not for us. So if there's some way in which we can be helpful, useful, we'd like to. I am the old guy on the panel. I bring perspective, and I want to talk about that a little bit later on. But I'm a child of the 60s. Anybody that was around in the 60s as a young adult, you recall the tumult that we had back then, and comparing that to today actually somewhat mild by comparison to what we had going in the 60s. It was women's rights, of course, and we had the civil rights were brutal, and they were inflaming all kinds of outrage and brutal things that were happening. We had the whole Vietnam War thing, assassinations of our leaders. It was just an incredibly difficult time. And so I reflect on that, and I reflect about what capitalism's role has been over a period of time. I started a company called Cascade Engineering a little over 50 years ago, after I spent a little time as a metallurgist. I went to Cornell as an engineering school, and worked in the aerospace industry for about 6 years before starting Cascade Engineering. And I've tried to practice what I thought was a better way to do things. As a child of the 60s, we kind of had this intuition or this thought that whoever was in charge was really screwing it up, and we ought to figure out how to do it better. And so my objective was to try things to do it better. And one of the things that we worked at, actually, by the time of the 90s, we had some programs that were effective at that. We called it Wildfire to Career. It was our first real trial. And after that, we encouraged, we were quite successful. I guess our key metric of that was the turnover rate for people that are in that situation, where they're coming from poverty and being able to have a career. And typically that is about 50 to 60% turnover per month in that category. And we were able to reduce that over a period of 3 or 4 years down to about 3%. So there was a dramatic improvement by really just taking care of folks. And it was, we actually had social workers in our plants, and it was working quite dramatically well. And we also continued with social programs that we declared ourselves in the early 2000s as an anti-racism organization, and worked at that. And that really was another boost to morale and to people really valuing each other. And then we also worked on a program of what we call returning citizens, those folks who are coming out of incarceration and giving them a chance to really blossom in our environment. So that was the social side. On the environmental side, we became a zero waste company, zero waste to landfill. I mean, literally, there's maybe out of our entire 5 plants that we have in Grand Rapids, we may take a half a load to the dump every year. We've learned how to recycle and repurpose everything in our organization. So that's the environmental side, plus a lot of other things. But I'll stop with that as an intro. That kind of gives you a sense of where I've been. I also taught at Cornell for 17 years, starting in 2002, a little course on sustainable business, and I enjoyed being able to be engaged with students on learning what it means to be in a sustainable business. And that was a project that I really enjoyed until 2019. So that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Fred. I'm Rob Kellogg. This is my 3rd month in Jackson, so I'm just new to town. And I'm a product of the 70s, and so when Fred said he's a child of the 60s, I said, Fred, do you mean you were born in the 60s? I was actually born in the 70s, so I don't remember any of that kind of culture stuff. But yeah, I'm new in Jackson, so I think I'm doing a pretty good job getting out and meeting people, because I know probably half the room here, so this is a good sign. So I have about a 25 years or so career. I would say the thread of it is kind of responsible investment and social entrepreneurship throughout. That comes in different forms. I started my career actually very early on working for a very small private company at that time. Back in 1996, we were the 13th fastest growing private company in the US. And then I kind of decided I wanted to go international and do some work there. So I did my master's abroad and did my thesis work in northern India on microenterprise, microcredit. We're going to probably come back to that later. But that was my first introduction into this whole area of Mohave Bermudas, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics back in the 1990s. So I was that's why I did my thesis on. He's kind of been a long time hero of mine. He's now taken over the country of Bangladesh. I think he did, was it 2 weeks ago maybe? It was a fairly current event, yeah. I've met him and he's been a sort of a long time mentor of mine. So I kind of come out of the responsible investment capital stewardship work, came back into the States and worked for a company called Institutional Shareholder Services. Very first generation, what is now referred to as ESG, but back in the day it was not called ESG. It was, and we basically came up with screened indexes, and we're going to talk about the kind of continuum of impact investing and what that means. But I did that for a long time, did that for a few years, and then kind of started moving west and lived in Denver for a few years. I had a startup, got a background working in climate tech and also in public policy with public education. And then I'm now the executive director at Silicon Couloir, and I'm in my 3rd month on the job, and it's going great. And for those of you that, I think probably a lot of you know about our mission, but for those of you that don't know, Silicon Couloir is about supporting entrepreneurs in the local community. And historically, that's been in the Teton region, but we are excited to announce that we're actually going to be taking on a fairly large project outside of the Teton area. We got a large grant from the Wyoming Business Council to do a year-long gap analysis for the entire state, to figure out why can't Wyoming figure out how to build a cohesive, integrated, vibrant ecosystem for entrepreneurs in various communities around the state. So we're embarking on that, and I think that's going to be a pretty good learning experience. Yeah.
So Fred, how did we get here? And maybe you can dip into externalities. So just a couple of terms, so we just want to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yep, thank you for that. Little question that has a big answer. I think it's interesting from a perspective standpoint to recognize that capitalism, as we know it today, has not always been this way. And for those of you who study, understand that. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to just highlight the idea that in 2 lifetimes, I'm going to do the math eventually on this time. I just had my 80th birthday, so if you take the time that I was born and you go back one other lifetime, you're at 1864. Think about that, and think about what capitalism was doing 2 lifetimes ago. First of all, the United States was in a terrible spot. We had just finished our Civil War. We were still literally slaughtering Native Americans. We were in a place where we were just a really rough spot as a country. But capitalism was just beginning its drive to industrialize the nation. And it was an incredible time where you think steel and oil and transportation and all of that was just beginning to unfold. People were still driving around with horse and buggy at that point in time. But the railroads were just coming in and were expanding. And capitalism really drove a lot of, there was a lot of personal gain, but there was a lot of personal wealth that was generated by those titans of industry at the time. And then along came, until about 1914, that started shifting. And the idea that it was kind of the consumer capitalism came into play at that point in time. And the idea that, we had World War I was coming up, and we were preparing for that and the Great Depression after that. So there's a whole kind of preparatory stage to all of those things that happened from 1914 to about 1945. And there was a lot of regulation that came into play at that point in time. And it was, there was a reaction to all of this wealth that was created and all these monopolies that were created, and they needed, there was regulation 1945 to about 1973 is often referred to as the golden age of capitalism. It was the time when we thought about, I mean, that was when they had that, what was the name of that show they show every year on TV that about the banker that did that treated his folks well. You know, that was a time when people who were in business cared about the environment, cared about the communities, and they really were making a difference with their businesses. There was a time somewhere in the 70s, 60s, 70s, a guy named Milton Friedman. How many of you know the name Milton Friedman? Okay. Milton Friedman famously said the only responsibility, social responsibility for business is to maximize profit for the shareholders. And you know, you can let the shareholders decide what they want to do with that money, but it is not to be anything with the corporation. That turned into what people call neoliberalism, and the idea that profit maximization is the way to think about capitalism. It is what drives everything. Open markets. You want to deregulate if you can. Famously, President Reagan mentioned that the problem is government, not anybody else. And so it's a time when we really had a tremendous rise in this thinking. Now, since 2000, it was these are not rigid points, but starting in 2000, I think people started hearing the difference. When I started to teach sustainable business in 2002, it was pretty radical to think about something that could be actually sustainable in business. But people were starting to test it. We of course had a big dot-com bubble and financial crisis. We have had rising inequality that is really very challenging and very difficult. The idea that maybe there is a better way to do this has been in the air. And it's something that I think we can think challengingly about is it okay to say that capitalism isn't doing what we expected it to do? It's different from saying the alternative to capitalism is communism or socialism. No, that's not the issue. That's not the challenge. The challenge is, can we in fact practice capitalism differently so that everyone benefits, and so society as a whole, and that our environment as well. And there's one other thing I want to add to this, and then I'll stop, is that we are on the verge of experiencing a tremendous disruption in capitalism because of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence has just now become something we talk about the last couple of years, even the last couple of months. ChatGPT is kind of the one that people always talk about. There's a book out that I'm really quite enamored with. If you want to know about a book that I would recommend, it would be Mustafa Suleiman's book called The Coming Wave. And The Coming Wave really characterizes what we're facing in this regard. You've got something called artificial intelligence. We know about this term artificial general intelligence, which means that eventually, if we are letting this go uncontrolled, we could be knowing ourselves as no longer the top intellectual dog in the universe. It would be this artificial general intelligence. There's an in-between space called artificial capable intelligence, which is what we're experiencing a lot of. So it's really the phrase that really caught my attention was the idea that knowledge is going to be democratized. The cost of knowledge is going to be much lower. So think about that from all the things that businesses do now that kind of capture their own knowledge around things. Think about drugs. Think about any kind of something that's patentable or something that is protected, or some knowledge that businesses have, if that now is generally accessible throughout the population, what's that going to do to capitalism? I don't think we know. I don't think there's an answer, but it is an incredibly interesting time to think about how capitalism is going to be impacted in the future, let alone the reasons why we are not getting the kinds of results. We have, the statistic that always bothers me is that we have at least 40%, and I can make a case that 60% of our population is in constant financial stress. That's just not healthy for a country. How do we change that? We don't have an answer to that, but I'm convinced that it's not necessarily going to be thought of and delivered by our politicians or by our nonprofits. We can ameliorate that, but it's not going to be really solid until we let business lead the way in figuring out how this is going to happen. And with that, I'll stop.
I got one little question. So then the externalities, just that, but before he speaks, I did want to let everybody know that if you give us your email, we'll follow up with all these references. I'm keeping a list of all the things that Fred tells us we need to read.
So the externality it's an economic term, and it refers to those things that business does completely legally, completely following this competitive notion that we have. How do you beat the competition? How do you be a successful organization? But the externalities are those things that inadvertently are happening as a result of practicing that business. And so an example could be the fact that we've got 40 to 60% of the folks in constant financial stress. An example could be that we've got climate change things that we can't figure out and solve that are coming at us. It used to be that we were worried about muddy streets and smokestack pollution, but that's an externality. But those are some of those have been controlled. Others are that we're doing that we inadvertently do are still causing difficulties. Those externalities continue to exist.
Thank you.
And I would just add that the idea of externality is really, like when you talk about this topic, you know, the revisioning capitalism, at the heart of it is this idea of externalities, right? Because it's basically the people who profit from the economic activity are not the same ones who also participate in the downside of the economic activity. That's the definition of the externality, right? And it happens in every single facet of economic activity. And so, like, you know, there's people who say, you know, pro-regulation, anti-regulation, whatever, but at the heart of it, every single regulatory agency, Securities and Exchange Commission, FINRA, the FDA, that is fundamentally what they're trying to solve, that gap of externality around economic activity that's produced through a capital system. I want to hit rewind on some of the history that Fred brought us through. Great quote, you guys probably have heard it before, when Henry Ford was asked, why do you pay your workers so much? What did he say? So I have customers, right? And I think we've lost a lot of that sort of mentality from our corporate leadership, not only in America, but worldwide. Another great quote, the famed sociobiologist, E.O. Wilson, many of you probably heard about him, absolutely brilliant guy. A lot of really, really incredibly smart people say he's by far the smartest person they've ever met. And he's the guy claimed fame for studying ants and basically extrapolated his observations of ant colonies to human populations. So he got in this debate, and the topic of communism came up, and his response was just so brilliant. His great theory, wrong species. Like what a genius answer, right? Like so, and it's interesting. Like not to get too political here, but we're seeing some very interesting dynamics broadly, nationally, in the U.S. and also globally in terms of what we're having around this push towards populism. And with our current two main candidates, Harris and Trump, both are, it's very interesting. They sort of have a different take on a very top-down economic theory of change for our economy, right? I heard a reporter yesterday talk about this. He described Trump's is bullhorn and a hammer approach. That was the analogy that he used. And then, did you hear that one in the Daily? And then for Harris, crowbar, right?
No, a chisel.
Chisel, okay, sorry. Chisel, yeah. And so, like, I think, but both, like, the point that he was making is a lot, our elected leaders or the top of the party bulwarks are basically espousing very similar sort of top-down policies. You're going to hear one candidate call the other communist over the next few weeks and months, right? And which there's a certain irony there because of the way that everything's shifted. But anyway, that's just not it. But I guess what's like, how many in this room think there's even a problem around our capitalist system? Like, because I don't want to suppose anything. I don't want to even suppose so half of you think there's a problem. And so that means half of you don't think there's a problem. Right? Only half of you had your hands up.
Institution or system.
Okay, so I guess let me rephrase it. How many of you are uncomfortable in the direction that capitalism writ large is headed? What's that?
Not sure which way it's headed.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Ask me in November.
okay. All right. Well, so I think there's some evidence that, Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There's a lot of patterns that we're starting to see, and one of the expositions of like when capitalism gets out of whack, as Fred kind of walked us through his historical whirlwind there. Like, what the capitalism version of the it's set in 1970 or the 1700s and the 1800s and 1900s have been very different sort of manifestations. But one of the themes that you see kind of happen over and over again, and you see sort of these revolutionary reactions, is the rise of wealth inequality.
Yes.
And that's again, it doesn't look the same exactly, but it kind of repeats itself, and when it happens, it's an indication that the economic underpinnings of that capital system, or that version of the capital system that is in industrial economy, there's something wrong. It's sick. So you guys probably know the stats, right? Like 1% of the population owns 50% of the wealth of the world. 1%, half the wealth. Right? 10% of income earners in the world capture 50% of all income. 2,500, there's about, give or take, 2,500 billionaires in the world at any given moment across the world. They control about 40% of all wealth. And they own, the wealth of 2,500 people exceed that of 4.6 billion people. So I think we're starting to see, kind of an aversion to that pushback against that. And honestly, you're seeing, I think it explains a lot of why Donald Trump is so popular. Ironically, right? And you're seeing the rise of all these populist movements globally. Argentina, Venezuela. I mean, I came from Denver, and over the summer and over the last few months, we had this wave of immigrants from Venezuela. It was just absolutely insane. The public school population in Denver went up 20% just because of Venezuelan immigrants, and they didn't even plan for that. This is they were bussed up coming across the border from Texas, thousands of people. So, and it's happening across Europe, right? There's this kind of populist revolt that's going on internationally. It's not just in the United States. And I think a big part of that is some of those wealth inequality stats that you're seeing here. And it's an interesting dynamic.
So Rob, before we open it up to questions, can you give us a little spiel on where we are now with impact investing and social entrepreneurship and how they work together?
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious. Let's just give a show. I just love to hear from people. What are you interested in talking about social entrepreneurship, impact investing? Do we want to go deeper on capitalism? What would be most interesting for everyone? Because this is a huge topic. We can go in we can meander in a lot of different directions.
I would like to know about return on investment using nonprofits to build for-profit corporations.
Okay.
I'm I'm drawing a blank with how we can.
Okay, so I'll jump in there and then we can kind of go from there, okay?
Well, let's hear from,
Yeah.
anybody else wants to throw up their hands?
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Mr. Keller because, you know, we both lived through the 80s when Gordon Gekko said greed is good. And there was a change during that time. And then we went from where senior business leaders would emphasize the interest of the shareholders, the employees, management,
Yeah.
partners, suppliers, and community. And even Andy Grove later came up with the phrase co-opetition.
Right.
So we had more of a presence in the 70s and 60s that you allude to, where a real great business leader had that focus of all of those dimensions. And then in the 80s, we lost our way and we adopted what you just said. But how, I guess I would ask, is do we get back to that? Because I don't think the populist movement is a solution. I don't think more socialism is a solution. I think it comes from a certain kind of leadership, and how do we get that into the community and change, Mr. Keller?
Yeah, hold on to that thought. John's gonna go a little
We'll
bit
keep going, because I just wanna make sure we capture it. Go ahead.
I'd like to understand how you think about impact investing,
Okay.
partnering with like the government grants that are coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, which when I talk with people in Wyoming, they say we are not taking advantage of it. I mean, it's sitting there and we're not organized to really go for it. So I see lethargy
Yeah.
of doing that. But so it would seem like that would be a good partnership, or what you think of those
Okay,
partnerships.
great, we'll adjust that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to hear you comment on the trends that are currently underway that you've identified, and the concentration, whether it's in wealth or income. And now we're going to be putting that in the hands of deep learning machines.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear why that isn't the same thing on steroids, and how you seize control of that to accomplish some of the goals that you identified that is necessary from the corporate world.
Good question. Okay, so there's three different directions we could go. No, that's fine. I think Fred and I are prepared to address all those. So we'll quickly hit the artificial intelligence and try to knock that one off. I think
No chance.
Let me check AI.
well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, what's gonna happen with artificial intelligence coming on and then AGI after that, and, you know, the timetables, no one really knows when we're gonna hit AGI, honestly. Like, I mean, I was just listening to podcasts, you know, two supposed experts, widely divergent opinions. Some said within a decade, others said it's not gonna happen in a century. So like how you define AGI, I think is you know, probably a question and a debate. But I think this is all coming down to concentration of resources, and I think just from a policy perspective, they're going to have. I mean, people are going to have to coalesce around universal basic income in some form or fashion. And that is going to have to get
Some form of what?
in some form or fashion. There's going to have to be some variation of universal basic income. Whether some people have a strong aversion to that because that has a socialist element to it. But what is essentially it could get paid for through corporate tax on AGI on AGI profits, right? So I think most people that are pretty seasoned and pretty well versed in this area believe that UBI of some sort is going to have to get adopted just to create some sort of floor in our economic base so people aren't left behind.
I would add that we don't know. We're entering a huge period of uncertainty. make the wrong one. We've got to be able to live with this uncertainty and stay in it. To me, that's the most important characteristic we can exhibit in the next 5 to 10 years, as we try to understand how this is gonna unfold.
Yeah. I repeatedly always say, like, learning how to learn is the dominant skill set of the 21st century, and I think that's what Fred's talking about. You just have to be really good about evolving your thinking and your skill set. Let me try to address your question around just, like, I guess is the continuum of impact investing and kind of what we're seeing. So I guess if we, and this is kind of artificial demarcation here, but these are like 5 or 6 points across the continuums to help give an understanding of what do we talk about when we talk about impact investing. First of all, when we talk about impact investing, there's who does it, who's it done by, and who's it done for. So there's two faces of that coin. The first face is it's the what, it's the where's it happen, who does it, who gets it, and like it can be like if you're a woman who's practicing regenerative agriculture in South Africa, that's a manifestation, that's a persona of impact investing, and then who's giving that capital to that person. So that continuum, on one side, you've got like the traditional players you might think of as VC and private equity. There are actually a lot of traditional private equity VC firms who actually classify themselves as impact investors. You know, I guess you could debate on whether that is true or not, depending on your definition of impact investing, but that's on one side of the continuum. If you go in one step on that continuum, you have what we kind of broadly, I mean, it's a politicized term now, but ESG screened funds. So that's you're screening out companies from an investment perspective. So like you've got in the 60s and 70s, you've got apartheid, you've got tobacco in the 80s, you've got in some screened indexes, you've got oil and gas companies. So those are companies that get screened out. So that's a negative screen. That's externalities. You make a determination that company has an externality on society, you want that externality removed from your portfolio. That's the next step in. And after that, you've got a screened in approach. So when I was at ISS, I was part of the team that launched one of the first screened portfolios for the FTSE for Good. So we did all the methodology. FTSE for Good, FTSE creates all these stock indexes around the world. Back in 2005, it was an affirmative screened index where we would run companies through our methodology and screen companies into the index. So that's a positive responsible investment screen. And that, I think, has probably captured more of the market now than the negative screened out portfolio. Okay, so then if we keep going further, you've got thematic investing. So you've got maybe some venture capital firms that all they do is invest in climate, in regenerative agriculture, or another sort of sector in East Africa, right? So those are thematic. Now, when you start to move, so there's a school of thought where you can beat market-based returns with a positive and negative screen funds. But then when you start to go into thematic investments, a lot of people think you're starting to have concessions on your rate of return. And so this is where, when you start to get into the later parts of the continuum around impact investing, this is where this idea of concessionary capital comes into play. So if you're an investor, you're investing in regenerative agriculture on farms in Rwanda or Kenya, you are sort of making a determination, well, you know what, that's really important from a social perspective, and I probably am compromising return on capital by investing there versus going into some other sector globally where I can invest. But that trade-off is worth it because my investors are seeking a social benefit in addition to an economic return. So that's where you get this kind of, you start to get this grain of objectives. And then you can move one more step over, and this is straight up concessionary capital. So when I was the executive director of a group in Denver, called Social Venture Partners, and I work with donor advised funds, and basically this is philanthropic. This is philanthropic money that was then going towards social mission investments in the community. So this is for-profits that they were investing in, but they were, by making that investment, they were actually conceding that they were gonna take a below market rate of return, because otherwise, they were philanthropists, they had money at their donor advised fund, and they were just gonna grant it out, and when you grant out money, that's 100% loss, right? You never get, so they just wanted that money to recycle back, so then they could give it over and over again. So anyway, that's a long-winded explanation of this, but that's the general, like, those are the main yardsticks on continuum.
So the last part is what you were asking about, was more like nonprofits and that kind of thing. Is that, did that answer your question?
Yep.
And that last part is you can go directly, you have foundations, so there's a lot of foundations now. It's sort of like, you know, he talked about the robber barons, and, you know, we know all of those foundations, Rockefeller, Kellogg, all that stuff. They used to typically just have grant money go out. That was they would have an endowment, generate return off their endowment, and then grant that money, and that was most of their program for impact investing. Now it's actually, they're taking money, they have an investment portfolio, they're making equity investments in social enterprises and getting that money back. But they're doing it with the understanding that they're getting a concessionary rate of return on that.
An observation there, Rob, is that the terminology is still on the basis of return on capital.
Yeah.
And you use the word concessionary as if that's you're making a concession.
Yeah.
And we don't have language yet that says we want to have a positive impact on the world. And and how do you measure that? So that it isn't just always a matter of looking at your return on your dollar investment. How do we have an understanding that our role in life isn't necessarily to make the most money, it is to make the most impact. And how do we make that shift? That's an unknown, but it's something that I think we can struggle with, and something we should be working with. And I think that the universities and colleges have a big role to play in this, because we continue to teach students about, maximizing their dollars. And we haven't talked about that.
Well, and a lot of the economic
So wait, hold on, let's finish. How about the infrastructure question?
Yeah, but you could also, the thought that I'm listening to you is the rate of failure. So there's going to be failure, so how are you gonna accommodate that in this, low rate of return?
Okay, go do that? Okay.
I can go on with the infrastructure. I'm just thinking, some of these projects, they spend money and then they don't ever go, they don't ever,
Yeah,
make their
so, I mean,
payments
you cited the Inflation Reduction Act, which is very interesting piece of legislation. First of all, it came out of, people have been working on it, but it really surprised everyone how that actually got through the sausage factory of Washington. That shocked everyone that made it through. So basically what the Inflation Reduction Act does is it deploys about 360, give or take, $1 billion in capital, direct capital, right? In the form of, it can be credits, it can be actual investments. There's a lot of programs that are trickling down. So at Silicon Valley, we're actually applying for an EDA grant, Economic Development Authority grant, it didn't come from the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's all these funding mechanisms to support our work, right? This federal funding is really important because it actually has a very high risk tolerance, right? It presumes a very high rate of failure, right? And it's catalytic capital. So what the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, for those of you who know, it's got the wrong name. It does address some inflation, but it's primarily a climate bill, right? And it's the largest climate investment that this country's ever made. And it really seeks to actually catalyze and transform capital inflows into all these early stage industries, and actually it's getting capital to investors. VC funds are getting capital from it so that they can deploy into invested portfolios. So it's trying to tackle this from a lot of different directions. But what's interesting about the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically the way it was designed, is, well, I mean, $360 billion for the government is nothing, that's chump change. But the add-on effect is probably going to catalyze upwards of $2 trillion, because it's basically making a lot of like industries that haven't quite gotten to the green premium yet, haven't quite gotten to that inflection point of being safe, proven industries. It's gonna allow for all of this capital to flow into it in more on safer terms. So it's gonna just get us to the finish line where we need to be in, if we're gonna hit these net zero targets by 2040, 2050, whatever they are. So that's the interesting thing about government fiat, is you can actually,
Well, what do you think about the comments from the state representatives, is that it's not being tapped here in the state of Wyoming? Is it, they've got the money and people are not producing projects that are, like have good engineering scopes.
Yeah.
They're just, it's not moving forward.
Yeah, so Wyoming actually, on a per capita basis, actually has a tremendous amount of capital that's flowing from the government right now into the state, and it's basically, a lot of it is on the sideline. So we've gotten some of that money to be able to help figure out how we can build a more robust ecosystem across the state. And we're gonna try to go after more of that grant money, because we wanna really try to figure out what is the secret sauce for Wyoming, because it's not gonna be the same as Colorado. Like, they're just I'm coming from that market, it's just very different, but there probably are some things in that we're not leveraging in Wyoming that we can be leveraging, that can help build and create like small businesses in Casper and Douglas and Gillette and Cody and all these towns, or try to create a vibrant ecosystem for entrepreneurs in those areas. So, and government money plays an important role in that. How's it going?
Okay, so I just to echo off that. So I'm the president of Central Wyoming College. I'm also we have this 2-year term where you're the president of the community college presidents, and my background is sustainable economics. So I'm hearing good stuff in my soul. But so I do think Wyoming is really bad at taking together our friends. My experience coming from Colorado Mountain College, and that where we did have sustainable business, sustainable economics, that's where I taught. Colorado was really good at capturing this stuff. Wyoming, I think, what I sense as president here is I was frustrated how terrible we are at writing grants and getting money and turning money away, because that's communism. If I take money from the government, and I mean, really, it's obvious to me that we're just not good at it. And so finally, the governor has just had this new grants program. He's trying to provide grant support. So we're currently, I think, at capturing money. Sometimes we intentionally say no to it, because on principle, we know that with affordable care things. But the answer, is education. The answer, I would say yes, and I think the tools are there. If you think of externalities, if you drill in on that, negative externalities is probably that you smoke a cigarette, secondary smoke. But the big famous positive externality is education. And so what do you do with positive externalities? You subsidize.
Yeah.
And we subsidize education.
Yeah.
And what do you do with negative externality? You tax cigarettes, right? So there's this. So what it feels like though is that there's lost faith in these long-term kind of public, school and education. And so what we find is education, in the last 20 years, especially higher education, is like it's not worth it anymore. There's this big theme to that, and so. There's the answer, but it's the value proposition. They can see education and its benefits, then you continue to subsidize it. But those subsidies are decreasing, especially in Wyoming. So the community college sector, where the community colleges are going in together to do yet another study to show the rate of return, and we did one about 7 years ago in Teton County, where for every dollar that the government spend in public education, the social return in terms of fewer people in prison, crime, et cetera, plus the income that people make was like 1 to 4, so it's a 400% return.
Yeah.
But people say, oh, I don't believe it. When you show them the numbers and you show that your multiplier was very reasonable and all this stuff, there's this really lack of faith in that squishy externality stuff. And I almost feel like it's a battle of information right now. Because it seems like if everybody really believed in these positive externalities, then you would say, well, I'm gonna support that business because there's a positive externality. And sometimes you do, but they have to meet the strong case in a world.
Closing in 5 minutes, thank you.
But I think that's a good idea. I think the framework is there, but how do you argue and show that positive externalities for our business? And I believe that you subsidize the good and tax the bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a firm called Generate Capital. I love their whole investment thesis. They say it's like the future of capitalism. I really like it. It's the 4 Ds. They democratize, digitalize, decarbonize, and decentralize. And they basically say all their investments, they have to check those boxes. And like, whether you're a company, whether you're an organization, whether maybe even if, like, this also applies for institutions of higher learning, right? Like, those 4 principles probably are going to be the future of, like, that's gonna be the 21st century, right? Like, all activity is probably gonna fall into one of those categories from an economic perspective. I just find that like a useful heuristic in terms of how to think about, like, what does the future of capitalism hold? Like, I think that's a pretty good summation of, like, how to think about the investments and your economic activity and, you know, what institutions should be doing in terms of generating that positive social rate of return.
And I'm optimistic though, because I have seen where this positive externality has been recognized for the public at large, and there's hope.
Yeah.
So I started first many years ago, started off thinking money was stupid, and I became a Peace Corps volunteer and I said money matters. And oh my God, money matters kind of thing. And then the first thing I studied was environmental economics, where it was a time where it was just kind of slash and burn treatment of the environment. But then there was this positive externality concept, right? All these different contingent valuation. You ask a person, would you pay extra to keep the owls in the forest alive? And you'd say, yes, I would. And so, and you basically, once again, kind of the government doing incentives or disincentives. And so in environmental economics, I think it shows that people now get the value of the environment. So I think there's other things that they can get the value of as well. So I try to be optimistic.
Well, and Fred started off by declaring he's a child of the 60s. It's a very interesting dynamic that's taking place with the Zoomers and the Millennials. There's a major shift happening, both from an employee perspective as well as just a consumer perspective. Their attitudes of like the 20 and 30 somethings are very different than I'm a Gen Xer, you're a boomer, right? You're waffling, okay. We won't press you on that. So, like compared to the later generations, there's something fundamentally different that's happening with the younger generations around their expectations of like what they want their companies to be. I mean, there's like crazy research on how millennials will literally just quit a job flat out, not have a plan B, if they think their company is not abiding by their expectations in terms of being good corporate citizens. I mean, it's flabbergasting how willing they're willing to just walk out the door and never come back. And so companies now are having to change, not only from a consumer perspective, but like there's a labor shortfall, right? They're having a hard time attracting employees, and they have to demonstrate to be good citizens, and it can't just be window dressing, it can't be just greenwashing.
I asked this gentleman to hold on a thought. Would you repeat your question?
Well, I was just saying that I don't think populism is the answer. I don't think socialism is the answer. I do think leadership is part of the answer. And I wanted to hear from you, how do we get back to a world where we value our employees
an interesting paper written in 1976 by two gentlemen.
Can the papers, the library, now book?
Haven't gone through that. Meckling and Jensen, called The Theory of the Firm. How many of you have known that? Anybody? All right. It really talked about the idea of aligning the purpose of the organization with the leadership of the organization. And it was the time when bonuses started becoming aligned with shareholder value. And that started a whole kind of thinking around that area. So what we probably need is something that's going to be a new narrative for us, because that narrative is still very strong. And the idea that we have a narrative that says, you know, the most important thing you can do is maximize shareholder value. Another interesting fact, there are roughly 7 million businesses with at least one employee in the United States. How many do you think are publicly traded? Anybody know the answer to that? 3,800, 3,700 are publicly traded. It's those 3,700 now control about 60% of the GDP. But there's still a massive number of organizations that are not publicly traded, who have the opportunity to think more broadly than just for their shareholders. Now, there still are a fair number of privately held organizations that are very, I'll call it greedy.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are a ton that are much more broadly and are more willing to think about second, third, fourth generation down the line. So we've got that brings me hope, that kind of thing, where we've got this opportunity to have this younger generation for one, and this great plethora of businesses that are willing to think beyond just shareholder value and having a purpose. We hear a lot about the purpose of an organization today. That's a very powerful narrative. If you have a purpose that is to make a positive difference in the world, that's pretty positive.
And I would also just add, like, there's been a huge shift in the last 20 years, not on the public market side, around this definition of shareholder maximized value, and there's much more attention around riding that out to stakeholder value.
Right.
And that's coming from pension funds. I mean, we often hear, we think most of the money in America resides in hedge funds and venture capital funds. That actually is a drop in the bucket. Most money, most capital assets in the US reside with pension funds, and they're actually under the control of pension boards that represent teachers, police officers, firefighters. So, like, it's actually working capital. And so a lot of those pension funds, and hedge funds go after that business, but they're not the owners of that capital. The pension funds are the owner of the capital. They're pushing public companies to move in a much more progressive direction. It's one of the reasons why we see now the SEC looking at rules to require climate disclosure at companies. So, I mean, like, this stuff never happened 20 years ago. So, like, even the public markets are going in a pretty aggressive direction around this corporate responsibility and addressing the externalities that Fred has talked about.
Can I get your reaction to the idea that dynamic of shareholders, I see it in my place of work, the difference between exactly what you're describing, 20 and 30-year-olds who will walk out the door right without any plan. I mean, if they do not think that you are taking care of them and being the company that they expect you to be, right? So there's some of these stakeholders, whether it's employees or consumers, if you're a business and you want to maximize shareholder value, not even stakeholder,
right.
You want to maximize shareholder, in order to get the right talent in the door in the form of employees, in order to get consumers to buy your product, you have to represent a certain thing. And I
I just wonder your reaction, how much is that mitigating what is perceived as the badness of the Milton Friedman profit maximization? Does that make sense?
How,
Like, in order to maximize profits, you can't just treat your employees, your consumers, and the environment, and all the stakeholders poorly, because your sales will fall and your talent will walk out the door.
Yeah, you're making a case for mitigating the effects at this point in time. Every business school has a 2x2 matrix, okay? So, on the vertical axis of this matrix is, impact.
Right, I was trying to be in the top right corner.
You always want to be in that, yeah, all right. And on this one is, complexity and cost. And so, the place that we want, that people are focusing right now is kind of the lower, putting it that way, it's not lower right hand. The lower right hand, quadrant. And that lower right hand quadrant is what we would call a win-win category. It's good for business, to your point, and it's also good for people. There's and if you were to equate that to the UN scopes of SDGs. Those are, would be scope 1 and 2. Those are things you can control within your own business. And that is an area where I think we can make a tremendous amount of progress. There's no question. That's where impact investing can make a big difference in the win-win category. You're gonna make a return for your investors. You're gonna also do some good stuff in the world. But there's another scope 3 would be things that are in your supply chain. Those things that are required to have more collaboration of organizations together. And that is also a doable thing, but it's gonna take some real convening and a narrative that says that's worth it. We don't have a narrative for that yet. And then the scope 4 and 5 are those things that are gonna take policy change. And that is gonna take a new vision of what this could potentially look like. That's the challenge that we have in front of us. We don't have an answer to that. But that's the kind of taxonomy we need to think about going forward, in my opinion.
And just for context, so that, there's a big brouhaha with the SEC. Companies had a shit fit because they were so worried the SEC was going to pass rules to require scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for their climate, and they just freaked out. And they said, well, we can't do it, blah, blah, blah. They weren't even getting into scope 3. Scope 3 is where the most emissions happen, and that's the hard one. But they freaked out and put a lot of pressure on, and SEC backed off its rules for that. But it's coming. I mean, the inevitable is getting delayed.
There was a woman in the back, you raised your hand a couple times.
I could ask. I hope I'm not getting off the subject a little bit, but just because you mentioned education, I'm a big fan of education. And I feel like there's many things that we don't have answers for right now. But what do you think AI will impact education to get those kids motivated? Because I feel like that could eliminate a lot of work. And how do we keep younger generations get motivated that there's something they can do?
I have an opinion about that, so I'll it's only an opinion, so I'm not a researcher, okay? But the opinion I have is that AI, first of all, is impacting education right now. We all know that. I don't talk to an educator that say, oh my gosh, it's right now.
Yeah, right.
It's impacting. My proposal is that we flip the narrative on education. Because right now, we use content as the objective measure. Do you know the content? And we hope that people will learn what we call soft skills by pursuing content. I think we need to flip that and make soft skills,
Yeah.
well, let's call them human skills, the objective, and we can use content to kind of get ourselves there. What do you think, President?
I think that's true, because you don't, even now with your phone, you don't have to memorize your states or capitals, you just ask your phone, so why memorize them? Maybe enough familiarity, so you know what questions to ask, but so much is changing, so we've embraced it, you can just embrace reality and say, okay, that's just the way it is. And so our faculty said, yeah, we're just gonna use AI, we're gonna manage it. The exciting thing, I think, for folks who aren't excited about education, is that now there's so much more, their brain is so much more powerful. And at the governor's Wyoming conference, a business conference last year, they had two presenters, and it was really interesting, because they explained how when they were designing the stealth bomber, they had this computer center in the middle of the desert somewhere, it was Nevada or Utah or someplace, and it was huge, ginormous. It was like billions and billions and billions of dollars of kind of computer chips and everything else. And they're running all these slow scenarios of how the molecules react when certain radioactive signals hit them and all this. And they say now that whole operation could have been done with AI for about $1 million instead of 50 or 60 billion bucks. And now they're saying, so when they apply it to these things, like how to put carbon for carbon sequestration, and how it can analyze it and determine and ask the questions, and it can, so hundreds of years of research in carbon sequestration can take place like 5 years, and all of a sudden like, holy heck, and you tell my kid, explore some question, and so much of the knowledge is in the kind of the web, and the cloud, and it's all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is too cool. It's scary, but it's also so powerful. So getting people to ask the right questions. So teaching the prompts, what questions to ask is part of it, and discerning garbage from non-garbage. And so librarians are becoming, I would say, like they're back in action, because there's so much garbage of information, and knowing which questions to ask was like the librarian back in the day. I'll tell you what questions to ask and how. And so it's different.
I mean, I think on this question, on the education and AI reception, I think a useful frame is, like, where do humans have the advantage over AI? And it's clearly in the we'll just call it like the soft emotional intelligence area, right? I mean, that's where we're gonna be able to outcompete AI. That's where probably most AI is not gonna ever be able to supplant humans, as long as we create the conditions where those skills are still important. And I just think like the content, yeah, gone are the days where you're gonna become a content expert. I just think there's gonna be like in 20, 30 years, it's gonna be, like, I have a friend, like he was telling me an interesting, he's an orthopedic surgeon, and he came out of med school, what, like 25 years ago now. And he said, what he learned coming out of med school to be a surgeon, and you can empathize with this, Michael, right? Is like robots do all the surgery now. He does no physical surgery. Everything's done through robotic. He's there in case something goes wrong, but it's all done robotically, right? This is someone who went through years and years of education and learned a very specialized skill set 25 years ago, which has been totally supplanted.
Yes. I have a question about that, or a comment, because in the beginning you said, artificial intelligence is going to democratize learning. But does it democratize learning and so understanding is left by the wayside? Because I think you can go to AI, you can find out anything, but do you understand it? And so I see that as becoming a bigger gap between the wealthy and the poor. Because the poor people are not gonna have the people to teach them what it means. And you go to college, at least I'm also old, I went to college to know what I learned. I that's my question, getting back to entrepreneurial stuff, because we want our entrepreneurs to learn things from the inside out, to have that entire knowledge. You don't wanna go to ChatGPT and say, how does a molecule work? You wanna understand that from the chemistry class.
Could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry?
Could you repeat the question?
I don't know if we're really working with one question.
Well,
Real short, we're kind of following a strand here, yeah.
No, it's about education.
Yeah,
It's basically
education,
about
right.
education.
Will democratization of, learning, I said knowledge, but learning, be, an actually accelerant to having more, income disparity is her
Yes.
fear, and I think it's a reasonable fear. I think we all we just don't know how this is all gonna unfold. And again, the book is really good at describing the need for controlling AI, containing AI. The quote I really loved was, the objective is not to stop AI as the Luddites tried back in the 1780s or 1810, I guess it was. Or it's not to ride the wave, but it's to sculpt the wave that's coming our way. And that's the challenge. How do we deal with sculpting that which is going to be so pervasive, so quickly? The costs are coming down dramatically in terms of understanding. I mean, the example he used in the book was, are you familiar with the game Go? It's a Japanese game. Within a matter of 3 weeks, he trained the computer to be practice that millions of times to learn how the best moves to take, and it beat the best people in 3 weeks. It's that kind of speed that we're getting to at this point in time. It's just amazing.
I also read that book, and
Yeah.
I've worked in climate change the last 4 years, and when I read that book, I thought, oh my God, I thought climate change was a problem. This is a serious problem.
Yeah.
So I resonate with that. This is a little bit of a threat. So a standard critique of capitalism is that it prioritizes the profits and socializes the losses.
Mm-hmm.
And from my understanding, you really can't uncouple GDP growth from emissions and environmental destruction, even with efficiency gains, because of something called Jevons paradox, if you're familiar with that. So if we look at profit, it essentially means getting more back than you put into something. And if we're talking about financial profit, where money is a claim on energy and materials, it means that you're getting back more energy and materials than you've put into a system. And by this very definition, this is extraction.
Yeah.
And it requires exploitation of nature and people.
Yeah.
So my question with that kind of
That was
foundation is that if capitalism is bound to this growth imperative, is there a world where capitalism can stand up without creating all of these massive externalities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is yes. Like, we have the wrong macro indicators right now. Like, there's the famous Ralph Nader quote, like, every time you hear an ambulance go by, the GDP just goes up, right? Like, that's an example of a cost externality. Bhutan is an interesting example, and it's like how replicable is that? I don't know, but they've actually done away with GDP measurements. They got a lot of pushback because part of being involved in the UN, you actually have to use some of these measurements, and they say we're not going to use it anymore. And they have, I think they call it genuine progress indicator or something like that. And they've kind of gotten rid of the traditional economic measurements of success. So I mean, that is a very how much can you replicate the Bhutan example to other areas of the world? But they've tried that, and I don't know. There's like 3 countries in the world that are net zero, well actually carbon negative, and they're one of them.
And I think that's the need for the new narrative that defines that. What are we trying to measure? And of course we measure GDP growth. And of course you measure, you know, profitability. And of course we open up the newspaper and we revere the person who is the new billionaire. I mean, it's all around money. And that narrative is extremely strong. Now, maybe the younger folks are gonna be able to change that narrative in that generation. And but we need, in my opinion, we need the business community to set that new narrative. And it needs to be strongly set by them. It's my passion, I wanna make it happen.
Well,
Let's go Rick first and then you.
I mean, this focus coming back to education we're talking about K-12 education, which is my field. It's interesting because there was a book by Seymour Saracen from Yale in the 70s that said the predictable failure of educational reform. If anything hasn't changed over time, it's schools in K-12.
Yeah, absolutely.
And problematically, we're living in a period of requesting institutions. So another Teton, who was a friend of Obama's, he said we've never been further away from this vision of whatever you want to call it, more critical thinking, soft skills, whatever. You know, we're going the wrong way educationally. You know, where, you know, and again, I don't want to get political, but, you know, people saying, let's forget about all that fluffy stuff.
Right.
You know, let's focus on content only, don't teach anything else. So we're further away from that model. I mean, do you see, I mean, that's going to be the challenge. The rest of the world's moving with AI and everything else is moving forward, and schools are more or less backwards.
Yes.
In 1916, John Dewey said, if it was more about what would end the problem than the answer, there would be a revolution. And that was 108 years ago. There has never been a disruption of the learning model. Traditional education, there's been disruption of the delivery of content, but what research shows is when you learn something, knowing that you're gonna have to take a test, you ingest it, you regurgitate it, and then you forget it, because it's disassociated. And that worked well when there was incremental change and product cycles were long and the world was stable, but as you said, we need to find a way to thrive in ambiguity.
Absolutely. And my opinion also on this is the community colleges have the biggest opportunity to make this change happen. It's the ones that have they don't have to, they're not trying to live up to tradition. You've got the opportunity to change that right now. Challenge.
Couple
Yeah,
more
I know, it's
questions.
already,
Couple more questions, and then we can
Yeah.
hang out and socialize. Who hasn't spoken yet that has a question? Is there anybody? Sir?
I'll just let you know some of my experience, because I've invested in impact, environmental impact specifically, and I have a tough time dealing with it, because not only is it, there's no money in it, talking regenerative agriculture, clean energy, and forestry, and changing the capitalistic system a little bit, but I've been losing a little bit of money in it. I have a capital lag.
I mean,
It's
rather
a
than-
16-year project.
Just for, if I could take the last question, you know, if you could just bring down to earth for, I mean, I don't know everybody in the room, but I know a lot of people in the room who are, you know, we're living here in Jackson Hole, we don't have a lot of money, we wanna get involved, we have a little bit of money to invest, like, how do we as individual citizens make a difference? You know, we're talking about these big policies that a lot of us don't have any control over, but, you know, how can we individually make a difference?
Well, I'll just jump on this one. So, I mean, Silicon Core is all about trying to create a vibrant ecosystem for entrepreneurs in the community. We actually have an expectation of our companies that they pursue a triple bottom line, so people, planet, profit. We want them to be good stewards of the community. We want them to be respectful, have a workforce. So that is an ethos, that's a value that we try to impart on the companies that we engage in. If any of you want to engage, I mean, we have donors, but we also have mentors. I've got Tom is on my board chair in the back there. Raise your hand, Tom. He's a mentor. He's on a couple engagements, and I mean, he can speak for himself. But I know he has a lot of he gets a lot back from from the effort he puts in with working with founders on helping them to get through these like inflection points that they have in their business. So and Jeff is a trustee, and we've got both the guys. I got like 3 or 4 mentors here. So yeah. So I mean, if you want to be a mentor, you feel like you have something to give entrepreneurs, founders in the community, please contact me, contact Christine, we've got a couple people from Silicon Core here, and let us know how we can plug you into our ecosystem.
And Rob, just a reminder that when you say nonprofit, you also meet nonprofit leaders.
Yeah,
It's not
that's right. We've actually recently gotten into supporting nonprofits. It's still a small share of our overall work, but I don't know. Maybe that's going to grow. But yeah, if you have a nonprofit background, there's a place for you at Silicon Core too.
I would add that, I think our biggest opportunity is to learn how to be inquisitive as opposed to judgmental. The best thing that I heard, at least recently, is that we should think of differences horizontally as opposed to vertically.
Yeah.
And we need to open our minds to what is possible. And we need to be able to help create a new narrative that says that we can do this kind of difficult work, but it's going to take us all working together.
Well, on that note, thank you. That's what we wanted to do. I'm so honored to have gotten to know you guys and have this conversation and to be in this room of inquisitive people. Just quick reminders. Thank you to everybody who helped with